Lots of conversation about the Constitution and Donald Trump, and we've got a constitutional specialist here to talk about it.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Professor Corey Brettschneider has been a guest before. I think he's got a really smart constitutional mind, and I lean on him for some analysis there. But he always manages to throw a little bit of politics in there, and so it makes it a dynamic conversation. And yes, he teaches at Brown University. For those of you who start to throw tomatoes at the screen over the idea that Dan just brought on a lefty liberal, the truth of the matter is that the seats available here for any constitutionalist or any person who thinks that what's going on is all constitutional and pretty and perfect anytime you'd like. I continue to tell you that it's a struggle, a very hard struggle to get anybody to actually articulate a defense of a lot of what's going on out of Washington. And that doesn't puzzle me, and sometimes does puzzle me. But good evening, it's nice to have you aboard. Our Friday programs are always recorded on Thursday, so if all heck broke loose today, I can only react to it on Monday. Of course, most of our Monday reaction, if the world doesn't fall apart, will be about the Patriots winning yet another Super Bowl. And I think we can say Super Bowl on the program, and we're just talking about the game, the big game, of course. Hope that prediction doesn't go haywire. I'm ambivalent. As a sorrowful Giant fan, I just lick my wounds and say, wait till next year. Here's this week's stuff on AG, immigration, all that.
The Judiciary Committee is considering moving forward to make Senator Jeff Sessions the next Attorney General.
He will follow the law.
That's something the previous acting AG, Sally Yates, says she was doing by refusing to enforce President Trump's travel ban for citizens from 7 countries. Trump fired Yates Monday night.
And she really is about justice. And her firing tells me that the Trump administration has doubled down on not adhering to justice and the rule of law.
Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Kilmartin told Eyewitness News that he has been in contact with his colleagues across the nation since the executive order was signed, and now since Yates' firing.
Right now, those who act in the federal government are getting fired for acting. Well, President Trump can't fire the Attorney General for the state of Rhode Island or any other state, so we will act.
All working together to reject this discriminatory and dangerous measure.
Massachusetts AG Maura Healey revealed Tuesday she's taking action in the courts.
My office is filing suit to challenge the executive order.
Kilmartin says he's reviewing the suit along with one out of Washington state.
If we find that we can have some standing, we will join in.
Here's a headline in Politico authored by our guest. Why Trump's immigration rules are unconstitutional. So there's your cliff note in a headline. I think we have another headline as well. Oh, this is an excerpt. Arguing that Muslims not on U.S. soil are protected in addition to those that are actually on the soil. You can read that if you'd like, if you've got a big screen, or I'll just have my guest explain it to you, and we'll get to that. That's my producer and her analysis creeping through. It's a middle paragraph in your political piece, and one which I think is the most questionable. So we'll go back to that, but it is a pleasure to have you aboard.
Thank you, Dan. Always a pleasure. We're in a different place. Last time we talked, I think there was a potential of all of this happening, and now many of the issues have come up and become live.
1, 2, 3. The immigration order, for lack of a better term. It's not a travel ban, it's not a Muslim ban, if you ask Donald Trump, but call it any kind of ban, roll on, I don't care what you call it. It's a thing.
Right.
It's an executive order that involves people who are coming and going in 7 countries of concern off an Obama template. It is unconstitutional in your mind because?
The order, I think, violates 2 crucial provisions of the United States Constitution. One is our Equal Protection Clause that bans discrimination and certainly intentional animus based on ethnicity, national origin, or race. The other provision is the religion clauses, in particular the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. There's a judge in California, for instance, who struck down the travel ban on grounds of both equal protection and establishment. And I, in the piece, say why this isn't just any opinion. It's actually right on the money.
So break it down for me.
Sure.
There's the constitutionality issue, and then there's the execution issue. The
That's
way
right.
this thing was rolled out, where the Homeland Security was briefed, and now we know that it was kind of last minute, and they were kind of chasing their tail, and the airports were full, and it was an operational mess and the like. Does the messiness of last weekend guide your constitutional analysis, or have nothing to do with it?
I go further. I mean, I think the order itself, the executive order signed by the president, is unconstitutional because it's based in his intentional, maybe concern for to protect against terrorism, but also is caught up with his animus towards Muslims. And he said that during the campaign. Rudy Giuliani said it pretty
Before we
clearly
get to that,
as well.
but to tell me, it was, we all concede,
Sure.
other than everybody other than Donald Trump and Sean Spicer and a couple other people in the White House with their fingers crossed over this whole thing, concedes that it was a rollout mess.
Right.
So even if it was constitutionally sound and it was from Pluto. Well, it's not. When you put in context the campaign rhetoric and everything else, the whole move is not from Pluto, but it was from Pluto in terms of green light, go.
Right.
Does that impact your analysis, or is that irrelevant?
Well, the messiness, I think, is an indication of some of the problems with it. But no, I'm going further than that. I think at the moment that he signed the
further
executive
or
order,
aside, I guess is what I'm asking.
I would say that it's a side issue.
Okay, that's what I. Okay,
It's the order itself and its intent that makes it unconstitutional.
All right, so
under these
let's
clauses.
move all the messiness
Sure.
of the operation
Sure.
aside and get to the meat of
Let's
your
do it.
expertise
Yeah.
on the constitutionality. To Rudy Giuliani's point,
Sure.
he was on Fox News explaining last weekend that Donald Trump called him, telegraphed a Muslim ban, and they repositioned it as a danger strategy. That which occurs in a telephone call or in a conversation preliminarily, I'm not so sure that will be admissible although there's argument that it might be admissible in some court proceedings to determine constitutionality.
Right.
What do you think?
I think that it's one piece of evidence, it's not the only piece of evidence, that the intent behind the law is caught up with anti-Muslim animus. And courts, in thinking about whether or not there's a violation of equal protection or free exercise, will consider things like the legislative record, statements by officials as to their purpose. Now, we have two very clear statements, one by Rudy Giuliani, several actually during the campaign by the president, about what they plan to do, and that it was a Muslim ban. It was intended to shut down, out of a fear of Islamic terrorism, Muslim immigration in particular. And more than that, the ban itself also has a clue as to the favoring of non-Muslims over Muslims. In its text, it talks about favoring minority religions from Muslim-majority countries that have been chosen, and that's yet another indication that this is about Islam.
It's kind of a reach out to go protect in as much as you're suggesting you can't prosecute a religion, you can't reach out and protect a religion.
You can't favor, as the Supreme Court says in one of the cases that I cite, an Establishment Clause case called Joel, you can't favor one religion over another. That's clearly prohibited by the Establishment Clause. So by saying he's going to take Christians from Syria but not Muslims, which is effectively what it says, that's itself also a violation of the ban on establishment of religion.
By the way,
it's not the creation of a church, but it's favoring religion in an inappropriate
Not for
way.
nothing, getting back to execution and this notion of extreme vetting, I'm not sure why the president's put himself in a situation where now he's got to determine that which is a Christian and that which is a Muslim based on how people react. Now, obviously, there's investigative proof that can be borne out, but you want to talk about giving yourself an operational headache, distinguishing between those who say they're Christian and Muslim, and what people will say to get refuge is gosh knows what, right?
And I think the idea, which you're exactly pinpointing, is also that it's just inappropriate to try to favor one religion over another. And how do we know that? There's just something uncomfortable about trying to ask people about their religious belief in order to determine their rights. And the Constitution thinks about that. And
but we do ask,
that.
you made a great point, to determine their rights, but if there's nothing wrong with asking them about their faith position and their associations when you're determining national security across the board.
Yeah, if the intent isn't to discriminate from the beginning, there are all sorts of questions if the true goal is security. But again,
I'm guessing our vetting process now, which can be a year to 2 years for people to come in anyway, does that.
Oh, certainly. I don't think that there's anything unconstitutional about a broad inquiry with an aim of trying to protect against terrorism, and that might include all sorts of questions about where one spends their time. The problem with this ban in particular is it looks like it favors Christian Syrians over Muslims, but also that it intentionally discriminates. There's a great case that sort of illustrates the idea and makes it clear, that comes from Florida. And it's a case where a bunch of city councilmen talked about trying to discriminate against this group, a minority religion, the Santeria, and then enacted into law a ban on animal sacrifice. Now, that's not exactly the same, but it gets to this idea that Justice Kennedy was identifying, that the intent behind the law, if it's based in animus towards a religion, in that case the Santeria, in this case Islam, it's unconstitutional.
Well, we'll come back and we'll talk about the template that they say they're using. Also, this notion of those in the country and out of the country. A local story we've been following from Brown University. All of that. Stay with us. That's a picture from a previous conversation. I guess that's a still shot. Oh no, they're moving. Yeah, he's moving. Dr. Amalaji is a big story. Long story short, if you're not aware of his particular saga, he was a guest here on this program a couple of months ago. He is doing God's work as a Syrian citizen of Aleppo, which is at the core of all that is evil and wrong in Syria right now. So many victims. He's a doctor. He's here at Brown University studying for 2 years. Goes home after semester number 1 to take care of some business, finds out that his visa is rejected, and then gets caught in this ban thing and can't come home. His wife's here, pregnant, the whole thing. And now his human story, I think, is one of those things, and there are many. There are translators from Iraq and Iran who are jammed up in this whole thing. All part of the humanness of this particular act fall out. Does that particular story advise the constitutional evaluation that you're making at all?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a deeply human story that people can relate to, and these abstract ideas can be discussed through argument and reason and hypotheticals, but in the end, it's about protecting real people who sometimes suffer for reasons that are unnecessary.
Well, there's always peripheral damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we go into a situation where we seek out terrorists, we lose one of our own,
That's
and
right.
now we say they're citizens that might have been hurt or injured or killed. Is this akin that there are people that get caught up in the crossfire of what could be a legitimate act?
Mm-hmm.
Or do these human cases actually end up being examples and testimony when some of the litigants, attorneys general and beyond, go in and say this act is unconstitutional?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there is a legitimate government purpose in trying to stop terrorism, but the really bad, and that might have bad effects, but the unnecessary effects when bias creeps into it and where policy gets mixed up with animus is the right term towards Muslims, people suffer unnecessarily. And I guess I don't know the story of this doctor, but from what you've told me, it sounds like this is a story of somebody who's unnecessarily suffering.
Again, what's the constitutional provision that speaks to that?
There are these two specific provisions, one guaranteeing equal protection of the laws. That's the text of the 14th
For those
Amendment.
who live here or those who don't live here?
So this is a hard issue. Certainly,
and this goes
if
to
you're
that quote that we put up early. You're suggesting that even Muslims outside the country
That's
have
right.
certain protections.
Yeah.
There's a lot of argument against
There
that.
is,
Lay
yeah.
it out for me.
So let me just give the other side. There's a case in the 19th century, a very old case. And remember, this is at a time of segregation. Brown versus Board of Ed hasn't been decided. And at that time, there's a case involving what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Congress passes a law excluding basically Chinese immigration to the country. And there's a story not too dissimilar from the one you just told of a Chinese person who had been resident in the United States who's denied re-entry. And what the Supreme Court says in that case is the opposite of what I'm saying. They say the power of the president, especially when it's combined with Congress, as in this case, is plenary. That's the technical term that becomes used for this idea that the president's power is absolute in that matter. And it suggests that the president can discriminate. So that's a case against what I'm saying. But now think of the differences between now and then. There was no Brown versus Board of Education. There was no equal protection ban on segregation. It was soon after the end of slavery. And things have frankly changed. We have a very different law of equal protection. In fact, the Equal Protection Clause at that time didn't even apply to the federal government. There is a doctrine called reverse incorporation that applied the civil rights aspects of the Equal Protection Clause to the national government. That wasn't in place. So a lot has changed since the Chinese Exclusion Act. And my view is that the world has changed so much, and equal protection law has changed so much, that absolute nature of the president's power is just not the case. And now I'll make a second, slightly more narrow point. The president here is acting alone. In that case, the president was acting along with Congress, and that weakens presidential power. So that's an additional reason to think that this is a much weaker case than and that would come out differently than the Chinese Exclusion Act case. But that's what makes it a hard issue.
The strength of executive order in general is what?
The president's power, this is a doctrinal idea in constitutional law, is at its highest point. This is a case called Youngstown that announces this after the Chinese Exclusion Act, when the president and Congress are acting together. Now, when the president acts alone, even apart from these equal protection issues, the president's power is much weaker. So this is a presidential executive order without an enactment of Congress that stands behind it. So it's already weak, and then the equal protection argument, I think, as this judge in California said, really invalidates it.
The pushback from the bureaucracy, there are lots in the State Department that have, to unpack in. The interim Attorney General, Sally Yates, says, you know what, I read this, I don't think this is constitutional. I don't think I want to defend this in the courts. She gets popped aggressively.
She cited Giuliani, by the way, in her decision to resign, and an interview that Trump did with Christian Broadcasting Network saying he favored immigration of Syrian Christians.
Do you think that that behavior advises a judge's constitutional ruling? Meaning the Attorney General's pushback, State Department pushback?
There have already been several district court, federal court judges who have suggested that the order is likely unconstitutional, one in New York and one in California. And the more public
in the
officials,
emergency phase of the airports, as lawyers were typing in hallways trying to get briefs done.
They did intervene, but they also said in the order, especially in the California one, it's very clear that the entire, what I'm saying, that the entire executive order is unconstitutional because it violates the Equal Protection Clause.
At the same time, when it
I'm not making it up.
No, that happened. You're absolutely right. But at the same time, aren't judges hesitant to get in the way of the executive branch's efforts to keep the country safe?
Yeah, and it's highly unusual for an attorney general to resign in this way. It brings to mind the Nixon.
Well, she got fired.
Yeah. Sorry, to get fired, but to basically
set herself up to be able to
set herself up by. She did not resign, but she opposed the president in a very direct way and declared his policy unconstitutional. All of this is very unusual, and it's unusual for a federal court judge to have an order saying that an action by the executive is unconstitutional in this way. But that goes to my main point, which is this is extreme, and it matches the extremism of the campaign.
When we come back, what's the local ramifications? Stay with us. So tell me, this executive order, the immigration situation, what people really need to remember, by the way, that this is not about the southern border and undocumented immigrants. We are talking about people who had otherwise lawful access to the country who have been stopped.
Correct.
And we can't lump it all together. There might be a philosophy that's operating in Donald Trump's mind that is cohesive, but I'm not so sure what it is. What's the local ramification? You wrote a piece in Time about that.
Yeah. I think the local angle, in addition to the specifics of the executive order and statements like you saw, good statements like you saw from the Attorney General, is that more generally states, and this is what I say in Time magazine, states and cities have the ability when the president and even Congress try to do something unconstitutional, they have the ability to protect people's rights. And they can do that in a variety of ways. President Trump has been threatening to revoke funding, for instance, for cities that fail to comply with his
sanctuary cities,
his proposed immigration enforcement, and he's threatened, I will take away all of your funds, is my understanding. Now, my understanding of constitutional law is that he can't do that, that there's a doctrine in the spending clause that says you cannot coerce by threatening the use of funds. Now, you can condition grants, but you can't coerce.
Okay, so there's the nuance.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the Federal Highway Administration funding that comes to states for seatbelt enforcement and the like can be withdrawn if the state doesn't embark on a certain amount of commitment and performance on that kind of standard speeding. But that is more formulatic, though, than discretionary. I don't like what you're doing, you're penalized.
That's right.
You're telling me there's a big difference between the two.
It's a difference between a grant and saying, if you want to carry out a certain program, we'll give you some money, and a threat, which is, we'll take all your money if you don't do what we say.
Now remember, that conversation is not what we're talking. That's a different executive order that we're discussing here. But the state's attorneys general in Mass, in Washington, in New York. Ours attorney general is on a milk carton somewhere, missing in action, but showing some false bravado. I oughta. I don't know if he's going to join it or not. You don't have to comment on that. That's my ongoing thing with Peter Kilmartin. But the state's attorneys general have the ability to do what versus these kinds of executive orders?
Well, they
litigate, sue, completely avoid the directives,
Absolutely. I mean, if funds are revoked, for instance, in retaliation for not complying, all of Providence's funds, the Attorney General or the City Attorney should and would file a suit saying that the 10th Amendment rights of the state of Rhode Island have been violated.
With that, now, seeing that it could hypothetically possibly happen, would judges enforce the continued spending? Judges don't often, they don't like to prevent something from happening. Someone could say, well, the money being pulled is, it'd be an interesting decision on stay in status quo versus forcing an action. They don't like to temporarily enforce an action. They'll stop an action. Right. So withdrawing money might be stopping an action, and would they stay that kind of thing? What would you forecast?
It's very hard to know. I mean, the district court judge in this California case, in the executive order case that we were talking about earlier, thought that it was likely that these constitutional claims would succeed, and so did intervene in the instant. And I could see that happening in the case of threatened revocation of funds. That's what I think a federal judge should do.
At the end of the day, it's a fast-moving conversation. Is anybody advising Donald Trump on the Constitution, do you think?
I honestly don't know. I mean, this order was drafted in a way, the scuttlebutt is that it wasn't truly vetted by lawyers. It seems very sloppy. The statements that were made were basically gave the game up, that it was based in animus. So I really don't know. It's not great advice, honestly.
When you say animus, you only got 15 seconds.
Yeah.
You believe, is animus really, you think, the motive?
I think it's caught up in it. The court's doctrine of animus is not the same as truly hating somebody.
Gotcha.
It's not what it sounds like. It's impermissible motive that's caught up with issues of discrimination.
All right, very good. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Fascinating. We'll be right back. As much as it pains me to say this as a depressed Giant fan, I don't see how the Patriots lose this thing on Sunday. Not when you give Bill Belichick 2 weeks to figure out the Atlanta offense, as high-powered as it is. So my guess is that you'll be celebrating and we'll be reviewing another Patriots Super Bowl on Monday night. Good luck.